Hey there, welcome to Human Physiology. This first video is going to cover the first topic on this checklist, and all subsequent videos will address the topics as we go down the list. So as you watch these videos, you can kind of check off things as we go along to help you keep track of all the information that we'll be covering. So since this is the first chapter in the Human Physiology textbook, you can imagine that we're probably not going to get into anything too terribly crazy just yet. We're really going to start, in this video at least, by laying down the ground rules on exactly what human physiology is and how it is distinguished from a very similar and related discipline, human anatomy. So, as I said, in this class we are studying physiology. So physiology refers to the science or discipline in understanding how a body functions. Now, anatomy, which at this point most of you have probably already had human anatomy, and it's not a problem if you have not. It's not going to disqualify you from doing well in this class. But since most of you probably have already had human anatomy, you're probably aware that anatomy is all about structure and organization. So in an anatomy class, you do a variety of different studies and dissections to help you understand where specific structures within the body are located and how they're connected to each other. So in physiology, we're going to be focusing a lot more on function rather than specific information on structure and location. But hopefully, as you're going to come to appreciate here, we really ultimately, to have a complete understanding of how the human body operates, we are going to need both sets of information in order for us to really understand how a healthy human body operates versus how one operates aberrantly in a disease setting. So if this were an anatomy class, you might see a statement like this one right here. The heart, if we're focusing on the cardiovascular system, the heart is a four-chambered organ. It's composed of cardiac muscle tissue, and it's located in the thoracic cavity. So this is a perfect statement for an anatomy class because it covers, for the heart, it covers what it looks like, what it's made of, and where it's located. But you'll notice it doesn't provide a whole lot of insight into function. What is the purpose of the heart? How does it do what it does? So in a physiology class, we're much more likely to describe something like the heart in this way. The heart is a pump-like organ that generates pressure differences throughout the body to supply oxygen and nutrients to metabolically active, demanding tissues. So this statement isn't necessarily giving you all the information about structure and location. It's telling you what does the heart actually do? What is the purpose in helping the human body to perform its day-to-day functions? Now, to clarify here, just because this is a physiology class, that does not mean we are going to pretend anatomy does not exist. The same way in your anatomy class, you likely did not pretend that physiology did not exist. The best way I think to think of these two things is two different sides of the same coin. Now, in this class, we are going to be spending all of our time looking at the physiology side of the coin, but we always need to be aware that on the other side of things, there is the anatomy side that we need to at least appreciate. There is going to end up being a minimum amount of anatomical information that we just have to have in order to really appreciate what's going on in the human body. Now, just to spend a little bit of time talking about anatomy, just so you can kind of understand what parts of anatomy are we going to need, what sorts of parts of anatomy are we not going to need, let's just have a brief little overview of anatomy itself. Now, anatomy, really you can split into two different ways. So gross anatomy is probably what you spent the majority of your time in your anatomy class doing. So gross anatomy refers to the study of body structures that you really don't need anything other than your hands or your eyes to work with, right? So this picture on the left shows a whole human brain. So you can manipulate this brain any way you want with your hands and your eyes. You can hold it, you can weigh it, you can take it apart with a scalpel and forceps, you can look at it with your eyes, you can observe all the different structures, you can cut into it and see all the different gray matter and white matter structures. So gross anatomy involves the study of structures that basically you don't need any help in order to appreciate. So we're not really going to be doing hardly any gross anatomical study in this class. What we will end up doing just a little bit of is what is called microscopic anatomy. So microscopic anatomy, as the name implies, refers to the study of structures within the body that you need a microscope in order to view, meaning things that are too small for you to be able to see with your eyes. So in this picture, we are actually seeing at the cellular and tissue level things within that brain tissue on the left there that you cannot just see by using your hands and using your eyes without a microscope. So we can actually see the different neurons and the different glial cells that make up the nervous tissue of the brain and of the spinal cord. So let's take a quick look at some methods of observing anatomy. Now, most of these we're probably not ever going to deal with, but they are at least worth knowing about. So dissection, if you've already taken human anatomy, you're well aware of this by now. So the idea here is that you've got a preserved specimen, but obviously one that is dead, deceased. So you cut apart this specimen in order to observe the structural relationships of all the different organs and components held within. You can gain insight into what these sorts of things do, where they're located, by looking at how they're organized within a deceased specimen. So in this picture, you can see a frog, which is kind of the popular dissection specimen for high school biology. In human anatomy, you are familiar with dissecting cats and other preserved organs and structures coming from things like cows and sheep and things of that nature. We're not going to do any dissections in this class. Now, here's something interesting that actually would, you'll see why I use the term would. Here's something that would be relevant to physiology, what is called a vivisection. A vivisection is a procedure in which a dissection is performed on a living organism. So you take an organism that is perfectly alive and you cut into them and experiment on them in order to gain live insight into physiological function. So, for example, you could say, vivisect a rat and start poking and prodding at its brain and seeing how different limbs move, so you can kind of gain insight into which parts of the brain control different things throughout the body. So this is something that was popularized back in the 2nd and 3rd century by a Greek scientist named Galen, who you can see a representation here on the left. Now, I know what you're thinking. You can immediately identify what the problem with vivisections are. It's horrible, it's brutal, it's barbaric, right? So thankfully, vivisections are not ethically permissible these days. So that's why, if this is the first time you're hearing about it, it's why you've never heard about it, because nobody does these things anymore. It's brutal, it's barbaric, it's all of the above, right? Now, microscopy is something that is very commonly done, something that we will do just a little bit of in this class. So we already saw this from our discussion on microscopic anatomy on the previous slide, but essentially the idea here is that you're able to get a sample of tissue from either a deceased or a live specimen, and you can stain and counterstain all the different cells and structures held within to allow those structures to be easily viewable by use of a microscope. And then finally, something that will be a little bit more relevant for a physiology class, imaging techniques, something that we'll talk about towards the tail end of this lecture series on Chapter 1. So this is going to include things like X-rays, CT scans, MRIs, ultrasonography, things of that nature. So the idea here is that we're able to observe body structures based on the way that the tissues and ultimately the structures themselves interact with different types of electromagnetic radiation. So the major benefit is here, and again, we'll have a more complete discussion on this topic in a later video, but the major benefit here is that you can observe someone's anatomy without them, being dead or without cutting into them. The major benefit here is a lack of invasiveness. Another way that we can look at anatomy is on a regional versus systemic basis. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because our discussion and study of physiology is going to kind of take a similar approach in terms of, do we study things that are all located in the same place at the same time, or do we study things based on an organ system approach, more of a systemic approach? So what do we mean by that? So regional anatomy refers to the study of body structures that just happen to all be located in the same place. So in the picture on the right, we are looking at all the different structures and organs that are contained within the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, not everything is visible here. You'll notice that you can't really see the stomach, but the abdominopelvic cavity contains things like the stomach, the intestines, the kidneys, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the gallbladder, reproductive organs, things I haven't mentioned like different arteries and veins. Let's see, you've got the spleen, so the liver, so there's lots of different organs that are contained all within the same space, right? But here's the thing. Those different organs that I have listed there are not all necessarily strictly connected to one another in terms of their function, right? Now, one of the things that we are definitely going to come to appreciate in this class is that nothing in the body exists in a vacuum. So everything has some effect on something else. So your endocrine system has some effect on the muscular system. Your nervous system has some effect on the immune system. So nothing really operates independently here. But that being said, if you look at the spleen, which is both a component of the immune system and the lymphatic system, it's going to have kind of a minimal impact on some of the digestive organs like the stomach, the intestines, the liver, etc. So if we wanted to study things on a regional basis, we would basically pick a place in the body and then just study everything that happens to be in that place altogether. My opinion is that's not necessarily the best way to go about it. So what we're going to do is study things on more of a systemic basis. So systemic anatomy and physiology really refers to the study of body structures that all together make up some functional organ system. So we can be confident that they all work together very closely, right? So an example here would be, say, we pick an organ system like the urinary system. So the urinary system consists of the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. So all of these things are involved in filtering blood, removing excess materials like water and salts and waste products to create a urine that is going to be transported from the kidneys through the ureters to the urinary bladder and then excreted out through the urethra. Now, all of these different structures definitely function together, but depending on how you define your location, they are not all necessarily located in the same place. So, as you can kind of tell from the way I've been talking, we are going to tackle things on a systemic approach in this class. We will start with, say, the endocrine system, then we'll move on to the nervous system, then to the muscular system, and then to the cardiovascular system, and then the respiratory, urinary, and so on and so forth. So we're going to try to tackle things in a systemic way, but as I said, nothing in the human body exists in a vacuum. So as we go along, we are going to try to build a foundation that we can kind of stack things on top of each other. Long after we finish the endocrine system, we'll be able to see how different hormones and different glands that secrete those hormones have effects on things like the urinary system. So now that we've kind of gotten our discussion of anatomy out of the way, let's talk about physiology itself. So physiology, as we mentioned, it is all about function. So the functioning of all the different organ systems all together, all at the same time, they function in such a way that the body maintains homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is a word that I am sure you have heard a lot of, but what exactly does that mean? So what homeostasis is all about is maintaining constant internal conditions, even though the natural inclination for things is that things want to change, right? So both internal and external factors are always going to cause things to change. Things like your body temperature, things like the amount of glucose in your blood, things like the amount of sodium in your blood, things like your heart rate, things like how much water is in your blood. So there are all these different parameters about your body, like your blood glucose and your body temperature and things like that. All these different parameters that if we left them completely alone, they would start wildly fluctuating. They would start changing. So what your body's function is all about is to make sure that we maintain those parameters within a very strict set of limits. We do not want things like your blood pressure or your body temperature changing too terribly much. And ultimately, that is what physiology is all about. That is what the function of things like your brain and your heart and your kidneys are all about. They function in such a way to make sure that these things like your blood pressure and your blood glucose do not change too terribly much. So if you want a specific example, and believe me when I say that all throughout the semester, we are going to see countless examples of homeostatic mechanisms in place. But to whet your appetite, if you want just one very specific example right off the bat, let's consider your body temperature. So say you are like this woman in this picture down here. Say you have just gone for a long run out in the summer heat. Now, what a run is going to do is it is going to drive up your body temperature, both being outside in the hot temperature and all of the muscle contractions that she uses to propel herself along during her run. Those are all things that are going to generate heat, and that is going to drive the body temperature up. Now, what your body desires for the sake of homeostasis, your body wants your internal temperature to be about 37 degrees Celsius, or if you prefer Fahrenheit, that's about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So we want to maintain that internal body temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius no matter the conditions. I don't care if it's 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside. I don't care if it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Regardless of what the conditions are, whether it's hot outside, cold outside, or whether you've been exercising or sitting on the couch, we do not want that body temperature to change very much, if at all. So we have homeostasis mechanisms like sweating when you get very hot or shivering when you get very cold to make sure that we resist these changes coming from these internal and external factors. We resist any changes that would cause things to fall out of balance. So like I said, we will see many, many, many more examples of homeostasis mechanisms in action. But as you can imagine, it's going to take a lot of study and a lot of time for us to really learn how some of these different organs and organ systems operate, for us to really understand how these mechanisms work. Okay, so that is going to do it for the first topic of Chapter 1. So congratulations on getting through the first video. There's going to be several more for Chapter 1. So check in next time and we will start talking about how the human body is built from the ground up. Talking about starting with atoms, moving to molecules, cells, tissues, and so on. How do you start with the simplest material in the universe, being an atom? How do you build that up to get to a full-fledged human? So I will see you next time. Thank you for your attention.